Alrighty, chapter 19 deals with World War One, and so again, I'm going to split the chapter into two parts. We're going to talk about World War One on the international front and the United States just prior to World War One and some of the things they were doing, and then part two will focus mostly on the home front. So where we left off is with Teddy Roosevelt. Of course, we've been talking about the Monroe Doctrine and how it's the foundation for American foreign policy. During Roosevelt's time, the Panama Canal became kind of the new wonder of the world. They knew that the countries within Europe wanted a connection between the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. And so there were actually two places where this could have happened. One is in Panama and the other is in Nicaragua. There's a rather large lake in Nicaragua, and they were going to connect a canal to that lake, and then on the other side it would connect to the Pacific. The French are actually the first to begin work on the Panama Canal. Ferdinand de Lesseps was famous for building the Suez Canal, and so he was contracted to begin work on the canal. And Panama at this time was owned by Colombia, the South American country. And the United States kind of steps in and begins to help, I guess you could say, or fund or kind of instigate a rebellion within Panama against Colombia. And by 1902, in the Spooner Act, the United States has taken control of the canal territory. So certainly the United States was behind this revolution. And again, the United States would become a protectorate for Panama, just like we have in Cuba. And Roosevelt is famous for saying, speak softly, but carry a big stick. So, you're not agitating people, but you have the military and the arms to kind of back up what you're saying. And we'll see that as we move forward. One incidental thing is the Florida East Coast Key West extension, which was the Overseas Railroad. Henry Flagler began this construction project just after 1900 and poured a great deal of money into it. And essentially what he was doing was taking advantage of the idea that there would be a canal in the Caribbean and that this would make Key West one of the most important places for trade and commerce within the Caribbean and within the Americas. Some people called it a failure. Some people called it, another wonder of the world. But it certainly never made the money that he put into it, never made it back. So the question is whether or not he was maybe jumping the gun a little bit. But this is kind of the excitement that people felt about this Panama Canal, that they really felt this was going to revolutionize world trade, which of course it has. The United States takes over the construction of the canal after the French go bankrupt. And so the Americans maintain this protectorate well until Jimmy Carter's presidency in the 70s, when Carter signs the treaty that basically gives the canal back to the country of Panama. Roosevelt is also known as a peacemaker, which is kind of ironic. The Russo-Japanese War breaks out in February 1904, and Japan is concerned about being able to maintain control over Manchuria and Korea. And as we've seen, hopefully, or at least you're thinking about this, Japan is looking outward. They are trying to develop a sphere of influence in the Pacific. And one by one, they're running into these countries that seem to have a stake in the game, so to speak. And Russia was one of these. What's surprising about this war, not only is it very short, but Russia gets its butt handed to them. They were um, greatly overpowered by the Japanese. This is one of the reasons for the Russian Revolution later on. But Japan gains this kind of foothold in Manchuria and Korea, and as we get closer to World War II, you'll see that this plays a major role. Theodore Roosevelt had held the treaty meetings in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and he ended up winning a Nobel Prize for his attempts at getting the war to end. Um, and it's kind of interesting because, you don't hear a lot about this war, but it certainly had a big role in the development of Japan as a modern military power. So this is a map showing the U.S. engagements in the Caribbean from 1898 until 1941. And as you can see, there's a great deal of intervention that takes place. And this is really the American foreign policy technique for the Caribbean and the Americas, is more of an interventionist perspective and less about letting the countries kind of figure it out on their own. And a lot of this is because the United States has a great deal of trade and large markets in these different areas, and they're trying to kind of develop those trade routes and develop those markets even further. So Roosevelt kind of takes interventionism a little bit further than most presidents have. He creates what he calls a Roosevelt Corollary, which essentially made the United States an international police power in the Western Hemisphere. So it's the Monroe Doctrine, but you're adding a military or interventionist perspective to it. And one of the key portions of his corollary is having a military, specifically a navy, that will be able to help him carry this out. And so this is where we start seeing the Great White Fleet, which was the American Navy that all the ships are painted white. And so it becomes vital for him to be able to have this Navy at his disposal so that he could intervene anywhere within the Americas in pretty speedily, so that conflicts did not get dragged out. The first incident, British, Italian, and German naval forces blockade Venezuela to ensure the payment of debts to European bankers. Roosevelt steps in and basically tells them, "You need to go. We will handle this." And so the United States steps in and handles the disagreement between Venezuela and the European bankers. In 1904, Roosevelt seizes the custom houses of the Dominican Republic to ensure that the Dominican Republic pays its debts to European and American investors. So the question comes up, where are America's spheres of influence now? So now that we have this Navy, where do we see ourselves having the biggest impact? And of course, along with the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary, a lot of that is in the Americas. But keep in mind, we also have Pacific colonies as well to consider. William Howard Taft, who comes after Roosevelt, takes a different perspective. His foreign policy is referred to as dollar diplomacy, and that is lending money or economic investment and loans from American banks rather than using the military intervention. So you could call it economic intervention. If you had a political or government in a certain country in the Americas and they were favorable to American trade, then America would invest in that country. If they were not, then they would lose out on the money that the United States would be giving to them. And it's seen as a very conservative approach, which of course it is. Um, and so Taft kind of comes out in comparison to Roosevelt, as we've seen on the domestic front, as being a lot more conservative and more focused on the economic advantages rather than on using military. When Wilson comes in, his approach in foreign policy is called moral imperialism. Sounds like an oxymoron, and really, in fact, it kind of is. He argues that Americans were meant to carry liberty and justice throughout the world, so go out and sell goods. So you're using economic power in order to spread capitalism and democracy throughout the world. This should sound kind of familiar because it's kind of the same thing that we do today. If you are acceptable to America in terms of a trading partner, then we have a tendency to kind of develop economic assistance programs. We have organizations that will come in and help with social issues. India is a good example because we have a lot of multinational corporations that go into India, and you have foundations that go in with them as well. So not only are you trading with India, you're also going in and helping them deal with poverty, education, and infrastructure problems. So America should be the conscience of the world, spread democracy, promote peace, and condemn colonialism. So here's where Wilson's progressivism pops up, because promoting peace and condemning colonialism, these are two pieces of the progressive puzzle that he focuses on. Now, that's not to say that the United States, purged itself of colonies. The United States did not. In fact, we hold on to them. And even under Wilson, we have the most military interventions taking place for any president up until that point. So he's kind of talking out of both sides. He's saying, all these wonderful things about peace, but at the same time, he's encouraging military intervention in places in order to, quote unquote, preserve peace. So this is a very contradictory policy. So one of the best places where we see this kind of era of interventions take place is under the Mexican Revolution. And I'm going to go quickly through this because it can take up a lot of time and we don't really need it to. United States and Mexico had kind of had not a very close relationship, but in 1909, there's a summit in El Paso, Texas, where the president of Mexico, Porfirio Diaz, and the U.S. President Taft meet, and they basically have a talk about the relations between the two countries. This is the first time a U.S. president ever crosses the border into Mexico, and the first meeting between a Mexican president and a U.S. president. Diaz had previously decided not to run for office again. That would have been his sixth term. However, after this meeting with Taft, he decides he's going to run again. And his main challenger is Francisco Madero. And he jails Madero Diaz jails Madero for a little while. It's definitely not an open election. And then, of course, Diaz wins re-election. Nobody's really surprised by that. But basically what it does is it throws the country into a revolution. Diaz is eventually overthrown and goes into exile. Madero comes into power, and then you have Victoriano Huerta, who begins to challenge Madero's regime. The United States comes in April 1914 and seizes Veracruz, Mexico, in order to protect American interests. The United States is certainly supporting Huerta because Francisco Madero um, believes that America is anti-Mexican in terms of supporting Diaz and then encouraging him to run again. Madero is, of course, um, not in support of the United States intervention. He doesn't solidify control, and he eventually is overthrown and assassinated. And you have yet another group of people who come to challenge power within Mexico. You have Pancho Villa, who begins to attack Mexico, from Mexico into the United States, and forces the United States to send in troops under General Pershing. And so General Pershing, this is the punitive expedition where Pershing basically goes into Mexico. And there's this, it's literally like this kind of Wile E. Coyote chase, like if you've seen in cartoons where there's like this circular pattern, there's like no rhyme or reason to it. And that's exactly what Pershing is doing. He's chasing Pancho Villa, but is really unable to do it. And this is incidentally the first time that we start seeing airplanes used in reconnaissance. So there's a picture at the very bottom of one of the early planes used by the United States for reconnaissance by the air. Eventually you have Carranza, who comes to power, and the United States supports him, and so you have this, the opponents who would be Pancho Villa eventually are jailed or taken out, and so Carranza becomes the main, the presidential candidate in the United States, signs agreements with him. So as we've seen, the United States kind of has this interventionist perspective when it comes to the Americas. However, what's growing on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean is taking a great deal of attention. And so you start having a number of things developing that are taking Europe into the Great War, or to World War II, or I'm sorry, World War I. There's an arms race, and we're not talking about missiles, but we're talking about ships. There is a new Dreadnought class ship that is being built between Germany and Great Britain, and these are, the latest technology in shipbuilding. As Germany is, trying to pump out a bunch of these ships, Great Britain is trying to pump out a bunch of these ships, and so it becomes an arms race between Great Britain and Germany. Keep in mind that both countries have a massive colonial empire that they're trying to protect. And so a navy is vital in order to protect your colonies. And so that's what really is driving this arms race. You also have alliances and secret diplomacy. Under Otto von Bismarck, Germany signed a bunch of alliances with different countries. Specifically, they have a very, very close relationship with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Wilhelm I dies, and his son comes to power and has a different perspective. So Wilhelm I was all about realpolitik, meaning using these alliances to develop a strong safety network to prevent wars and to prevent other European countries from interfering in your political control. Wilhelm II comes to power, and he's got a totally different perspective called Weltpolitik, which means world politics. And this is where the secret diplomacy starts coming about. The idea that Germany needs to be a world power. And so this creates a automatic distrust between Great Britain and Germany. And of course, you've got this arms race going on at the same time. The Balkan crisis, this is when Archduke Ferdinand is assassinated by the Black Hand, who is being funded by Serbia. You have these countries that are all part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. When I say countries, I mean it's a loose country because the Austro-Hungarian Empire is in control. But the empire is very quick to diffuse any independence movements. And they're very fierce about it. They kill people, they put people in jail. Um, and so you start having a number of these countries begin to push for independence and push for more of a voice in the empire. And um, Franz Joseph, who is the head of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, refuses to budge on any of this. And then you also have the issue of imperialism and colonialism. As Germany calls it, a place in the sun, meaning a colony. And you have many countries now having a large colonial empire to deal with. And they're very protective of that. And so if you're going to hit a country, you want to hit them where it hurts. And the colonies are a great way to do that because that's where they're getting all of their raw materials from. So for the United States adopts an official neutral position, impartial in thought as well as in deed. And of course, the United States' largest trading partner is Great Britain. But they also recognize that to side one way or the other would mean that they could be a target, especially for Germany and submarine warfare. In 1914, the Germans invade Belgium, and this is called the Rape of Belgium. And there's a depiction on the right of a German soldier standing over a woman and child. All you see in the background is destruction. And this was a huge image thrown about in popular opinion about the Germans. So the Germans were just ruthless, that they raped and pillaged Belgium. And really what the Germans were doing was trying to keep the Belgians from trying to overthrow their German conquerors, which is, one of the aspects of war. By 1915, America becomes the arsenal for the Allies. We've begun to supply the Allies with war material. And so the factories in the United States are beginning to produce bullets. They're producing ships. They're producing food items that will be shipped over to Europe. And of course, the biggest event for World War I, or the entry to World War I, is the sinking of the Lusitania on May 7, 1915. And this is when almost 2,000, I guess, 1,100 people die. 28 Americans were on board. And so you have Germany essentially saying, we are now going to have unrestricted submarine warfare. Obviously, this impartial in thought as well as in deed isn't working, which is not a big surprise because the United States is heavily funding British trade and British military through goods and services crossing the ocean. So compound this with the Zimmermann telegram, and this is a telegram sent by the German foreign minister to the president of Mexico. British intelligence actually intercepts the telegram, but basically Germany is saying, okay, we're going to start unrestricted submarine warfare. What we need you to do is to agree to, if in the event that the United States comes in to the war, we need Mexico to open up another front in terms of the United States. In return, we will give you all of the lost territory of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, that whole southwest part that was taken probably not, actually less than 100 years prior. British intelligence hands this telegram to Wilson, and of course, immediately it gets published in the newspaper. And this is a way to throw even more support behind America getting involved in World War I. So the writing's on the wall, and you have, but here's the thing you got to remember the United States as a whole is not supporting America getting involved in World War I. It's a process that they have to go through. The Lusitania probably is the closest point in which they decide, America decides that it needs to go into war um, in Europe. But prior to this, there's great deal of animosity towards the United States joining the war because they saw it as a European affair and not something the United States needed to get involved in. So the preparedness movement is a group of Republican leaders, including Teddy Roosevelt, who began to push for America to prepare for war. The military was heavily understaffed. I think they had like some, if I have numbers in here, I don't think I do. It's very small military. You have more National Guardsmen than you have Army men. And so they want to institute the Universal Military Service. Lindsey Garrison, who is the Secretary of War, supports this. And Wilson says, you know what? This is unpopular. I cannot allow this to continue on the cabinet. And so Garrison is removed, and Newton Baker comes in as the new Secretary of War. But what happens is it's more of a secretive, kind of behind the scenes mobilization. The National Guard, as well as the Army, begins to mobilize and train. And the Navy also begins to get funded by Congress for expansion. And so America realizes very quickly that there is little that America would be able to do should war erupt between the United States and what's going on within Europe. So they need to hurry up and get ready for it. So February 3rd, 1917, President Wilson announces before Congress that a break exists in the official relations with Germany. That's supposed to be Germany, not German. March 1917, Russia goes into the first part of the revolution. The Russian Revolution is very complicated, but let's just say February Revolution in Russia, March 9th, the new provisional government, which is no longer tied to the Tsar, is recognized by President Wilson. And so this clears the way for Wilson to declare war on Germany. He did not want to do it while allied to Russia and having the Tsar in power, because for PR purposes, it's hard to have a war against a dictator, meaning the Kaiser, when you are allied with the Tsar, who is actually the Kaiser's cousin. Kind of ironic how that happens. Anyway, so April 2nd, 1917, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. 4 days later, they approved the declaration of war. And then in December of the same year, they declare war against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So we're kind of going to skip around a little bit, but looking at World War I and looking at the soldiers, the picture on the right shows you what all soldiers would be carrying with them. There's a gas mask, there's guns, there's spikes, boots, all of these things would be on them. And you can see on the left what all that would look like. This is not a war where soldiers are mobile. And this is why the trenches become such an important aspect of World War I, because they've got all this crap. There's no way that they could, move around or storm anything with all this junk on them. So the trenches become kind of an inevitable front of the war. So here we see the Western Front. You can see the armistice line in green. That's where the line is drawn before the peace is signed. So that's, once the war ends, that's where the forces are. So you can see there's a great deal of movement. But one of the interesting things about the trenches is that it becomes a literal site of war. It's no longer targeting cities and bombing cities, even though they do, but the front becomes a physical scar on the face of Europe. And even today, you can go to places and you can see where the trench was, and it looks like a gigantic hole in the earth. Some of the toughest fighting along the front. It's unimaginable how the world went from, really not a very technological way of fighting to kind of implementing a number of very horrific tools and weapons of war. So here's kind of what the front looked like. The picture on the left, you'll see no man's land. This is the space between the trenches. Typically, it was bombed. You can kind of see a picture on the bottom right of what it looked like. No trees, nothing. Nothing survived there. You would have bodies, maybe horse carcasses, puddles of water mixed with blood. It's just, and then you have the barbed wire, and then you would have these trenches. There's the frontline trench, and then you would have the support trenches, and then you would have the reserve trenches. Aircraft become important in this war because they're able to fly in the air, and they take pictures of the front, and they can tell where the forces are weak or where there might be amassing a assault from a certain point on the trench to go across no man's land into in an attempt to get to the other side. And then, of course, you've got artillery in the back, which would just fire weapons continuously. Some pictures in the trenches on the left, and then, of course, another diagram of the trench warfare. Tanks were very important. They proved to be one of the ways in which you could advance on a trench. They're clumsy. Rarely did they actually work. I think the British tanks would break down constantly, so they weren't real reliable. Of course, by World War II, they are perfected and become much more important weapon of war. But it is important to recognize that they were here on the trenches in World War I. So African Americans are used in World War I. You have a number of figures. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Young. He was the third African American graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, first black superintendent of the U.S. National Park, first black military attaché, and the first black man to achieve the rank of colonel in the U.S. Army. He was the highest ranking black man at the beginning of World War I. The problem is that the president did not feel that white soldiers would serve under him. And so they put him into basic retirement or put him on a disabled list so that he would not actually be in combat during World War I. Henry Johnson, known as the Black Death, that's his picture at the bottom right. Little guy, but incredibly brave. He was known, let me get to where I'm going. He enlisted in June 5th, 1917. He comes under fire from a German raiding party, as many as 24 Germans, and he's using whatever weaponry he had to fight off the Germans, and he saves a fellow soldier as well as other remaining soldiers, and he suffered 21 wounds in that battle fight. He was awarded the French Croix de Guerre, which is the French Cross of War, with a special citation and a Golden Palm, which was France's highest honor for bravery. And he was the first American to receive it. So we have African Americans who are serving in combat, who are proving themselves time and time again, but this is a rarity. Because in 1917, you only had about 10,000 blacks in the Army, 5,000 in the Navy, and they were serving all below decks. It's a very segregated military, and there were absolutely no African Americans in the Marines. But 370 black men are recruited by the draft boards. The majority of them served in labor battalions. So they were building things, they were, reinforcing the trenches, they were unloading cargo ships. But you had some, about 42,000, that actually saw combat. And incidentally, as a concession to the African American activist camps, mainly the NAACP and W.E.B. Du Bois and some others that were working with Washington, there's a black officer training school that opens at Camp Des Moines in Iowa. And 1,250 were enrolled with 1,000 receiving commissions. So that was seen as a concession to the black community. So most of the African Americans serving in combat were assigned to French units. And this is largely because the French units were decimated by the time the United States came over. Of course, the problem was that they were given French weaponry. The men they were fighting with were French, and they probably spoke English, not very well, but all of the training material, all of their stuff was French. But you have some units that are remarkable in terms of what they accomplish. And the Harlem Hellfighters, 369th Infantry, is one of these. And that name, Harlem Hellfighters, was given by the German army. So that should tell you something. They spent 191 days in the trenches, more than any other American unit, and also suffered the most casualties of any American unit. They trained in Camp Wadsworth in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and you can bet they faced discrimination there. They, like other African American units, were reassigned to the French army, but out of this infantry, you had 2 medals of honor, several distinguished service crosses, 170 of them were given the French Croix de Guerre, and a unit citation for the entire regiment by the French military. So they basically kicked some butt. So as we start to work towards the end of the war and ending it, and of course they knew that the Paris peace talks would be where the treaty would be worked out. Wilson prepared his 14 points, and these are things that he wanted to get out of the Treaty of Versailles. And keep in mind, his goals are around peace, continuing peace, getting rid of colonialism. So he wants open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, removal of economic barriers, reduction of armaments, adjustment of colonial claims, all the way through, going all the way down to the creation of an association of nations. This is his 14th point, and this is his baby, and this is what becomes the League of Nations. The picture on the left kind of shows you not a very favorable view of Europeans, but it really sums up the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson approaches this as we don't need to force anyone into a situation where they accept guilt of the war. I mean, he wanted to treat Germany and Austria-Hungary with a sense of respect, because he understood that if you didn't, that this would sow the seeds for future war, which is exactly what the treaty did. So when he goes to treaty, he's part of the Big Four: Great Britain's David Lloyd George, France's George Clemenceau, and Italy's Vittorio Orlando. And of course, the thing that Wilson wants to walk away with is the creation of this League of Nations. He also wants to instill this idea of self-determination for Eastern Europe, meaning that they are able to decide what will happen to themselves. In other words, they will be able to create their own government. There are a few people who get robbed. At this time, Gandhi and others of his followers come and plead to have India made an independent state. That, of course, does not happen, and so India remains a British colony. Ho Chi Minh, who will become North Vietnamese leader, approaches the leaders and also asks for freedom for Indochina, which is Vietnam. Ireland also wants to seek independence from Great Britain. And all of these are turned down. But probably the biggest loser out of this whole group is the Ottoman Empire. And it had been called the sick old man of Europe because it was literally about to fall apart anyway. It was a relic of an empire barely holding itself together. And World War I is what kills it. And of course, it breaks into parts. And eventually, the main part of it becomes Turkey. But what the Treaty Committee does with this is they create what they call mandates. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So territorial losses, Germany loses all of its colonies and loses territory. There's a little piece of land that gets flipped back and forth between France and Germany. When Germany wins, they take it back. When France wins, they take it back. And it's Alsace and Lorraine, which are two provinces that are right along the border. And Germany loses those again. You also have new states that are carved out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire: Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Germany's army is restricted to 100,000 men. Their navy is limited to 6 pre-dreadnought class ships and 15,000 men. Article 198 of the treaty states that Germany could never have an air force. And demilitarization of the Rhineland and occupied by French military. The Rhineland, of course, is the area between Germany and France and I believe part of Belgium. So not only is Germany losing all of these things, it's also being occupied. And if you think about Reconstruction, you remember the South didn't like that very much. Well, you can imagine the Germans don't like it either. The economic settlement, Germany would owe 32 billion gold marks, and failure to pay would force Belgium and French soldiers into the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr Valley was its center, Germany's center of industrial power. Most of the factories were in that area. We don't really have something comparable in the United States, but it's like the Silicon Valley of early industrial revolution. So for them to occupy it meant that any profits coming out of the Ruhr Valley would be taken by France and Belgium to pay the reparations. And probably the biggest thing is that Germany accepts responsibility for the war and all of the dead. So when Wilson comes back from Paris, he faces a Republican majority in Congress. This is a midterm election in 1918 that brings the Republican Party back into control of Congress. And the biggest problem that the Republicans have is this idea of foreign entanglements. I mean, you can see that in this cartoon where you got the U.S. Senate coming through the window saying stop. One of the things about the treaty, the treaty, and especially with the League of Nations, is that the League could declare war without permission of member states. That is something the United Nations cannot do. That's huge. And that was something that Republicans really could not accept, that they would get back into a war quickly if it suited European powers. And they were just not supportive of that. So you have the irreconcilables who were Republicans unwilling to accept the treaty, and congressmen from states with heavy German and Irish populations who were against the treaty because the Irish, of course, wanted independence from Britain, and Germany is getting basically the shaft. Democrats supported the treaty with no changes because that's what Wilson urged. And then you had isolationists or extreme nationalists who opposed the League of Nations component. And so the major figure of opposition was Henry Cabot Lodge. So, in fact, the treaty is never actually It comes up for vote twice. It's never actually passed by the Senate. So we've never accepted the Treaty of Versailles in American history. While Wilson is trying to battle it out, he has a stroke, which would tell you exactly how much pressure he's under. And he nearly dies. But that just basically puts it to bed, that they'll never take the treaty back up. So this map here shows Germany following World War I. The demilitarized zone is that Rhineland area between Holland, Belgium, and France. Alsace and Lorraine is that territory I was telling you about that gets flip-flopped between different wars, and that goes back to the 1700s, where literally these two little provinces go back and forth. Germany was forbidden to unite with Austria. And you'll also see over here this kind of yellowish-looking area. This was called the Polish Corridor, and Poland, according to the Allies, needed a port. And so Danzig becomes this free city run by the League of Nations. Basically, it doesn't belong to anybody. But the Polish Corridor was given so that Poland would have a port. And then, of course, on the other side of it is East Prussia. So you've got Germany basically divided by this Polish corridor. This is what's left of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It gets broken up into all these little different groups. We'll be talking more about this as we get closer to World War II. And this was a portion of the mandates. So mandate, basically, think of it as a colony or a protectorate. Protectorate is probably a better word. So the British mandate of Mesopotamia was here where Iraq is, and eventually it will become Iraq. The French mandate of Syria will eventually become Syria, but it's under the French. The British have Mesopotamia. The British also have Palestine, which is here in this lower side. And then you have an independent Saudi Arabia and you have an independent Persia. And to the north, of course, is what's left of the Ottoman Empire, and that's Turkey. And Turkey forms its own government. So when we look at Europe between 1914 and 1919, you can see a vastly different map now. Finland becomes independent. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria-Hungary, Yugoslavia, all of these are countries that never existed prior to World War I. And it'll get even funkier as we start talking about World War II.